Uh, let's rock and roll here. Uh, I've been asked by a number of why we are doing this information on Spanish language and the culture of the Hispanic community, and there are a couple of reasons. Number one, we've been asked to do so by the bishop. So, and number two is whether or not they are involved in our church. We live in the middle of a predominantly Hispanic community, and we have had very little in the way of interaction or contact with them over the years. And our bishop believes that if the Diocese of Arizona is going to grow, that there has to be a way to get together, and that's pretty much what we're dealing with. And there's a larger question too that comes into that. Why should we learn about Hispanic culture when we are in fact part of the dominant culture in this area, the English-speaking dominators? And there's an interesting story I want to tell you, and it gives, I think, some insights to it. When I was an undergraduate, I was going for a liberal arts degree, and I was required by my university to take 4 semesters, 2 years of science courses. And like many of the liberal arts people, I took the rocks and stars option. I took a year of geology and a year of astronomy. The astronomy probably did me more good because it was primarily a math course. But the rocks course was taught by an old New England geomorphologist named Robert Nichols. And he had an interesting way of discussing things. And once he told us, he said, "Now, if you happen to be walking down Professor's Row and you encounter the Medford-Gabbro Diorite Dike, which connects us to Harvard University, take your hat off to it, because it's older than you are." What he was saying is that it is proper to accord some respect and some understanding to things that have been here before we have been here. And in the case of the Hispanic community here, its roots in North America are over 500 years old. In 1776, when the 13 original colonies on the East Coast declared their independence from Great Britain, the largest European cities in North America were all out in the West. San Francisco, San Diego, Santa Fe, and they were all Spanish communities. And they were all communities that were populated by Spanish-speaking people. English was not spoken in this region for another 100 years after the Declaration of Independence. And this has been continuously an area where the majority of the population speaks the Spanish language. The contributions that European Spanish made to this area are really kind of hard to comprehend in about a 15-minute thing. And what I want to talk about is a little bit of the history and some of the antecedents for what we're dealing with now. And I want to talk about contributions in about 3 or 4 different areas. I want to talk about the contribution of language, and I want to talk about the contribution of food and diet. All right? And I'm not talking tacos here. Food and diet. I want to talk about the contribution to our own understanding of theology and liturgy, our religion. And I want to talk about the city building that occurred at the very beginning and continues to this day. So, anyway, that's the general premise. Right now I have 14 minutes left, and we're going to cover about 500 years of history, okay?
Oh boy.
So, everybody knows that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. There are some reasons that he came this way rather than going around Africa to get to India. Number one, that route had not been discovered in 1492. It was not discovered until 6 years later. But the Portuguese were already operating on, up and down the coast of Africa. And the Portuguese blocked the Spanish from going that way. And Columbus was convinced that you could get to India and control the spice trade, which was important because the spice trade was controlled by the Viennese and the Muslims. And the Spanish didn't like either because they had just completed a period of 750 years where they were dominated by the Muslims. You know that Spain was occupied by Islam from 750 up to 1492. Interesting year. The removal of the Islamic presence in Spain took place over a period of about 100 years. It took a while to do it, and finally it was concluded in 1492 with the combination of the principalities of Castile and Aragon. And Isabella and Ferdinand married, and together their forces were able to drive the last of the Moors out of southern Spain. In that same year, an Italian named Cristobal Colon came to Castile and visited with Ferdinand and Isabel, and convinced them that they could bypass the Portuguese influence in Europe by going to the west. And the Spanish crown gave him the money, and he took off with 3 ships and about 100 men and ended up in the West Indies on the island of Hispaniola. On that first mission, there were no priests. The intent was not religious conversion. But after he brought his information back on what he found, the crown immediately authorized another expedition, and 2 years later Columbus went back. This time he came in 1496. He came back with Franciscan priests. This is fairly important because it has an influence on us to this day. The Middle-Age Spain, those areas that were not under Islamic control, and even those that were tremendously influenced by the Franciscans, whose movement had come out of Italy in the 1200s. All right? And many Franciscans at the time had become priests and clergy in Spain. This is a small cross from Guatemala, which has a shape which is very famous because it is the shape of the San Damiano cross, which was the cross in Italy that Francis was praying in front of when the Lord appeared to him and said, "Francis, restore my church." And this cross still exists today in the chapel of St. Clare in Assisi, and it's 7.5 feet tall and quite wide, and it's quite a magnificent piece. The Franciscans had a very mystical and somewhat penitential view of our theology, and that had been embraced by Spain and was brought to the New World in 1496 by the first of the Franciscan ministers who came through at that time. Very, very, very ancient roots. The Spanish moved very quickly in the New World. And then, and things happened very, very fast. In a very, very short period of time, many ships came over with lots of soldiers and horses and cannons and everything else, and pretty well conquered all of Central, South America. The Portuguese had a foothold in Brazil, but Spain took over most of that. And then almost all of the western United States became essentially Spanish territory. In 1519, the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabel became King of Spain, Carlos I. And Carlos I pulled off the ultimate political coup. He became appointed the Holy Roman Emperor. And so he essentially had the church authority for most of Europe, including over the Portuguese. And so by fiat, Spain took over, at least religiously, Portugal. And they were able to dominate the Portuguese colonies in the New World. And so, in about 1522, the Empire of Spain became the largest empire the world has ever seen. It was larger than the Roman Empire. It was larger than the Islamic Empire. It was larger than China. It included all of South America, all of Central America, all of what is now Mexico, and the entire southwestern United States, including California, Nevada, Arizona, and about 3/4 of Texas, New Mexico, and southern Colorado. That was all Spanish territory, and that remained Spanish territory until 1826, when it became Mexican territory. And so that whole area became part of Mexico until 1848, when the United States, by war, was able to take over the parts of the territory that we have now. So we had 250 years of Spanish, not only influence, but presence in this area. They conducted the religious affairs, they conducted the government affairs, they both enslaved and nurtured the Native Americans simultaneously, and they provided some of the cultural background that we can still see evidence of today. We live in the state of Arizona. It's a Spanish word that means dry place. We are next door to Nuevo Mexico, New Mexico. We are this side of California, another Spanish word. We are south of Nevada. Okay? We are south of Colorado, the place for the Red Rocks, and so on. And we are not far. We are one state away from Texas, or Tejas, another Spanish word. The oldest and in many cases the largest cities to this day in that area were established by the Spanish. San Diego, San Francisco, Sacramento, Santa Fe, San Antonio, El Paso, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. This is part of the legacy of the Spanish language in our place names right here in Arizona. A very, very large percentage of our place names are Spanish. In California and New Mexico and Texas, that's even more common. And in southern Colorado, where Harry used to be, we have San Luis and Alamosa and Durango These are all Spanish language names that come from that area. And the Spanish made a contribution too. One of the things we don't really think about is that before the Spanish came to the western United States, the primary foods were corn, beans, squash, and that sort of thing. So corn, beans, and squash. What did the Spanish provide? Well, Arizona is famous for its cattle industry. It's one of the 5 C's on the state seal: cattle, copper, cotton, and I can't remember what the other 2 are. But cattle were brought into the state of Arizona. They were Spanish longhorn cattle that were brought in by Father Kino, who was a Jesuit, and established the missions at Tumacacori, at Tubac, and at Javier de Bac, south of Tucson. And he literally created the cattle industry and created a demand for cattle. He introduced the cattle to the local Native Americans. We call them the Tohono O'odham now. They used to be called Pima and Papago. And the Pima thought these cattle were really great, and he would provide calves to them, and they would breed them, and then they would turn them loose and go hunt them. They hadn't figured out the concept of slaughterhouses yet. And as a result of that, wild cattle started roaming all over southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, and South Texas. And the great herds that were brought up through Abilene in the 1800s were when cowboys would go down and round up these wild cattle and bring them up to places like Dodge City and Omaha and what have you, to put them into the marketplace. But that whole legacy comes from the Spanish. At the time of the Spanish arrival in the Western Hemisphere, there were no domesticated animals anywhere in this entire hemisphere, even in the Aztecs, except for turkeys. Those were the only things that were domesticated. So sheep, hogs, cattle, goats were all brought to the Western Hemisphere by the Spanish. 100% of them. Okay? The wild pigs that run around the Caribbean and are such a nuisance were originally introduced by the Spanish. This sort of thing. Most of the vegetables that we eat, with the exception of corn, beans, and squash, tomatoes, and potatoes, were brought over by the Spanish. Father Kino introduced into Arizona wheat, which was a real favorite with the Native Americans because they could only grow things in the summer. So he brought in winter wheat. And so they had a winter crop. And at one point, the area from all along the Gila River, clear down to Yuma, from around just south of here down to Yuma, was a 4-mile wide wheat field, and was the largest wheat producing place in North America. Okay. That was all from seed that had been given to the Pima by Father Kino, and that sort of thing. Rice was introduced by the Spanish. Barley. Almost all of our grains, with the exception of corn, which was a native. There's an interesting phenomenon, and this is really kind of cool. All over the Spanish-speaking world, corn was so common that the corn tortilla, was extremely popular. Only in southern Arizona, up until relatively recently, was the wheat flour tortilla popular. And it was because Father Kino had introduced wheat in this area, and they started making their tortillas out of wheat. So now wheat flour tortillas are all over, and that's what you make burritos out of and that sort of thing. But that was originally brought into that area. The European flat beans, garbanzos and fava beans and this sort of thing, were all introduced by the Spanish. I have a book here called The Gardens of New Spain, and it has one page of the fruits and vegetables and meats that were available to the Native Americans at the time of the Spanish arriving. There are 8 pages of what the Spanish brought over.
Wow.
And it's small type. So, that sort of thing. Hispanic religious ritual blended, interestingly enough, very easily with most of the pre-existing Native American, quote, religion, which tended to be animist in nature. Most of it centered around bringing the clouds down and giving us rain and making us healthy. And in the Tohono O'odham language, they talk about the O'odham Hayam, or the Santo Hayam, which means the way of the traditional way of the O'odham, or the way of the saints. And either one, they're interchangeable. Yeah, so they don't have any particular problem. They didn't have a particular problem adapting the Hispanic religion. Yesterday, a group of us from this church went down to Mesa Arts Center, and we went to the Day of the Dead. This is a ceremony, or excuse me, a festival that is practiced primarily in the Hispanic community, but it has roots that go back almost 3,000 years to the Aztecs. And what it is, it used to be in the old Aztec calendar in the 9th month, which is about the 1st of August. They would have a whole month where they would honor those who had gone before them. And when the Spanish came through in the 1500s and conquered the Aztecs, they took a look at this and said, hey, this is no big deal. This is All Saints Day. And so they superimposed the 3-day festival of All Saints, which includes All Hallows Eve, Halloween, All Saints Day, and All Souls Day. And now the Day of the Dead is celebrated on those 3 days. And the Day of the Dead allows people to honor their family members who have died. And it's a way for them to not only honor them, but to remember them and to be inspired by their lives. So it's a very, and there's a lot of folk art and kind of local ritual. One of the things they do, many people will build an altar in their home called an ofrenda. And the offering will feature pictures of their loved ones, orange Mexican marigolds, which are said to attract the souls of the dead, so that the souls of the dead will come and visit the altar. And they'll put out little offerings, and they know full well that no creature is going to come and eat those unless the dog's been left out at night. And they leave them out there because they believe that the spirit of that offering will be incorporated by the spirit of the ones who have gone before them. If you would like to see some pictures of what we saw yesterday, I have them on the computer here, and I can set it up before I have to run over to choir practice. and you're welcome to take a look at those.
One of the things that I found absolutely entrancing about the altars that were set up in memory of family members, like grandparents, were, along with the photographs, maybe of their wedding picture or with their first child, they also had mementos that the family had held on to that were connected to the individuals. So one couple who had been married for 50 years, and so you saw their wedding picture, and then you saw a picture towards the end of their lives. The man's hat was there, and his sunglasses, and the things that were around that half of the altar were things that were important to him or things that he enjoyed. On her half of the altar, there was a gorgeous picture of her as a young woman, and then there were some, like a tamale maker and all sorts of ingredients for, I assume, some of the favorite dishes that she made. And it was just touching to see these really personal things that were included on that altar as a way for the family to celebrate the lives of these two people who had been really the foundation of their extended family. It was really very, very special.
So, which brings up one of the things that's fairly fairly important in understanding Hispanic culture. In many ways, the family plays a much more central and important role among Hispanics than it does even in our own culture. There is much more interaction. There is much more of a propensity for homes to have multi-generational families, and sometimes 3 generations. And we don't see that as much in our culture. But that goes back to, essentially it is the nature of a strong agrarian economy. These people, for the most part, all over North America, were farmers. And farms have different physical requirements than living in an urban area. Essentially, you keep your kids around because you need help plowing.
And then your grandkids.
Yeah.
And your great-grandkids.
Yeah. And obviously that's an oversimplification, but there is some truth in that. One of the most interesting things about Hispanic religion is the way that different churches or groups within the church come together in procession on various holy days. And you've probably seen around here the processions that go on the 12th of December on the Feast of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And Nancy and I saw this extremely in California, but it goes on here too. And the processions go back to the Middle Ages in Spain, when the only communication that the clergy had, other than at the Mass, which was done in Latin that nobody understood, the only communications they had with people in the vernacular, in their own language, was on these days of procession. And so they would get together and they would do processions. The penitential orders that developed, the confraternities that developed in Spain and were later transferred to the United States in New Mexico and southern Colorado, these confraternities were able to pass on a tremendous amount of religious education to virtually everybody in their community through these processions and ceremonies, and it was sort of like theater. And people would learn through theater. The penitentes in New Mexico during Holy Week have an event called the Encuentro, where the women of the village will have a statue of the Blessed Virgin, and the men will have a statue of Jesus. And they will bring those two together during Holy Week to represent the last time Jesus and his mother met. It's called the Encuentro. And this is commonly done in New Mexico, southern Colorado, parts of Arizona, parts of Texas, and parts of California. So it's not an underground thing or anything else. In fact, up until very, very, very recently, it was the dominant religious culture. So we just have to kind of understand that. So if you see the Medford Gabbro-Diorite Dike walking down Professor's Row on its way to Harvard, take your hat off to it, because it's older than you are.
Bill, one thing that I wanted to share with all of you is that as a volunteer at Banner Bay Wood Medical Center, we get a manual, and we have to learn all the different cultures of all the different people we are going to be working with, and families primarily. One of the things that I noticed with the Spanish culture is that if all of the family is not there, this is for surgery, and I do surgery ICU. If they're not there for the patient in ICU or there for the patient in surgery, it's a direct insult to that person if the whole family does not come. So you will see sometimes 25 to 30 people sitting in our family waiting area, and if you get 2 or 3 of those families, we have no place for anybody else. But, I mean, we literally don't. But we have learned that you have to respect that culture. And there are different ones. I mean, we have the Iranian, we have every culture there is possibly in my manual. So it's really a very family-oriented culture, very much so.
Those of you who were at the diocesan convention this year were introduced to the Church of St. Mary, the Iglesia de Santa Maria.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you heard was the church started with one woman. Was the only one who came.
Yeah. We sent out invitations.
The next week, she brought her daughter. And then the family started coming. And the size of the family was, for most of us, enormous. And that's the way the culture works. Family has a central importance that you can't believe if you're not from that culture. I went to a little church in San Sebastiano, outside of Guadalajara. And that entire church consisted of 2 families. And those 2 families brought somewhere around 75 to 80 people into that tiny little church every Sunday. 2 families. Family is important.
Nancy and I went to a Christmas party one year in Albuquerque, and it was hosted by our butcher. It was families from little toddlers up to old people, and lots of music and singing and one thing or another. And I made the mistake of saying to him, and because most of the conversation was in Spanish, I said, I've never been to a Mexican Christmas party before, and I think it's absolutely extraordinary. And he said, and it got quiet there. You could have heard a pin drop. And the guy said, Mexican? He said, I am Spanish. He said, my family has lived here in this general area since 1701.
Yep.
Well, and so many of them want you to know that they are Castilian Spanish.
Yes.
Right.
They are
Not
not
Mexicans.
Mexicans are half Spanish and half Indian, as far as they're concerned.
And yet, over time, it's become almost impossible to know the difference.
Yeah.